So I'll go ahead and get started. So just a quick session overview. What we're going to talk about is, again, how a systematic narrative review differs from other reviews, such as literature reviews and systematic reviews, and the place of a systematic narrative review for qualitative research and education. And I'll also talk about how you basically take your research question, break it down, and how this can help you to identify relevant literature for your systematic narrative review. Now, just to be clear, in this session, I'll focus on the process of documenting and gathering the research you use for a systematic review or a systematic narrative review. I won't focus on how to analyze the literature review, but I'll provide references that can help you to understand how to do this. And the recommended reading, if you saw it before or if you see it after, actually gives some very good examples of what a systematic review or systematic narrative review looks like as far as the process and also the synthesis of the research. So specifically, we'll look at creating search strings and then, of course, understanding EPPI Reviewer to distill the literature. If you have any questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat, and then when we come to Q&A, I'll have a look at them. Just some initial thanks. Thanks to Amy and Paul in the School of Education for putting this together. I also want to thank Sarah Kebbell at Strathclyde University Library, as well as Lynn Irvine and Paul Cannon. Those are subject librarians, and subject librarians are really good people to reach out to if you're doing a systematic review or systematic narrative review for the first time. And also to my friend Sarah Felix for looking over my slides. So an overview of literature reviews, just very quickly. You probably know what a literature review is, or you may have come across them. You'll often find these in undergraduate, postgraduate research, and postgraduate taught dissertations, but you'll often also find them in the beginning of a kind of a journal article. It sets the scene, as if as we say. Systematic literature reviews, they can be published, so you may have come across these. There's also scoping reviews, and then what's called a systematic narrative hybrid literature review. Now, for this session, I'll be using the term systematic narrative review because it's easier to say than systematic narrative hybrid literature review. And that's by Turnbull et al. So types of literature reviews, just to give an idea, literature reviews, they often again form a part of a dissertation or a journal article. They tend to be used to survey the literature, to identify a gap, and then formulate a research question. Lit reviews or literature reviews are good for understanding what the literature says about a particular topic. They aren't exhaustive, but they can be comprehensive of a particular topic. Also, researchers who conduct a literature review are expected to summarize and synthesize what they read, especially within the small space they have for a kind of research paper. On the other hand, a literature review that's a systematic review aims to answer a specific research question. So unlike a literature review, we usually don't have a specific research question we're asking. We might, but usually it's to kind of explore and set up the literature. Systematic reviews, therefore, are good for understanding what a large body of research says in order to understand, for example, an answer to a research question. So, for example, if you were interested in inclusivity in the context of higher education, there would be a large enough body of research to draw upon for a systematic review or for a literature review. However, if you're doing an emerging topic, then you might want to do a scoping review. But in this session, I won't talk about scoping reviews. Now, the most important aspects of a systematic review or a systematic narrative review are that generally your search strategy should be reproducible. What this means is if I do some research for a systematic narrative review, and then my friend in another university does the same kind of search, we should be able to find almost the same, if not the same, resources. So this is the key aspect of well, the key difference between a literature review and a systematic review. A literature review, what I do may differ from what my colleague at another university does. We may find very different answers based upon our interests, the sources we find, so on and so forth. Also, systematic reviews usually are conducted by a team, whereas a literature review is often conducted by one person. So allegedly, this means that literature reviews are more open to bias and systematic reviews are less open to bias. I'm not sure I agree with either of those statements, but I'll continue. So what's a systematic review? It's a rigorous means of answering a particular research question. So it's a happy medium between doing a literature review and doing a systematic review. It requires a specific research question to start, and also it requires that you document the entire process of finding your literature. So again, allegedly, this helps to reduce bias in comparison to a literature review. Now, the paper I draw on is from Turnbull et al. 2023. It's a great paper to understand what a systematic narrative review is. So I highly recommend that you kind of look at that and read that later. Just some select books that I can recommend on understanding a systematic review, because the process for doing a systematic review is more or less the same for a systematic narrative review. These are three great resources that you can kind of look up later on. And again, as I mentioned earlier, tracking your progress, or rather your process of conducting a systematic literature review, narrative review, is important. So here's just one example of a resource that you should read. It's the Prisma Statement 2020, which also has some information on doing scoping reviews as well, which I see Paul has just put in the chat. So this is a good read that you can take away and read about what are the different steps that you need to do to conduct a systematic narrative review or a systematic literature review if you're doing it with other colleagues. So at its heart, it's a very cyclical process. You have a specific research question. So if you don't have a research question today, please get to that first before you start. This can then lead to your methodologies, whichever they might be. They might be qualitative or qualitative means, for example. It's also, as I mentioned earlier, your search strategy has to be reproducible, because this helps to justify the sources that you choose and the databases that you choose that then inform the research that you undertake. After you do this, ideally, probably, you'll read your articles that you've chosen for themes. And the themes will slowly begin to emerge and you will analyze these. But again, it's very cyclical. So you'll probably keep going back and forth just a little bit. Now, for data analysis, if you're doing a qualitative means of data analysis, you might use a thematic analysis. And Brown and Clark is a great resource that talks a lot about how to do this. This will involve coding ideas as you read. You might do this using a software called InVivo. And then that should actually say themes emerge, not themes emerging. After this, you'll synthesize your findings, and then you'll begin to report on your themes. So the themes will become more concrete, more clear, and probably fewer. In the beginning, you might have dozens of themes or sub-themes, but by the end of it, you'll have fewer. So ultimately, your answer arises from, again, what you have read, what you've synthesized to answer that research question. So again, it's cyclical, and as it's a cyclical kind of process, you should be recording, tracking, and checking your steps at each point of the way. So again, takeaways: a systematic narrative review answers a specific question. Your literature search strategy should be reproducible. Now, I'm going to talk about this later, and I'm going to tell you in the session how to make it reproducible, because actually a lot of students and staff who conduct a systematic narrative review for the first time often find this a bit challenging, especially if they're not used to searching for literature. Then again, the analysis and the themes, they come from what you create, basically, based upon your research question. So ultimately, it's a very creative, very cyclical process that can be quite rewarding in answering a question. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at breaking down an example research question, because what you have to do is you have to take your research question and actually analyze it. So here's an example research question. Now, ideally, you will work with either your supervisor or your colleagues or even your subject librarian to craft that research question so that it becomes answerable in a very kind of coherent way. Now, as an example here, the question is, what does research in the UK demonstrate regarding practical actions for undertaking decolonizing higher education? So for your own research question, what I would suggest is you analyze it and you answer these three questions for that question that you have set. So what are the key parts of my question? What words or phrases would you possibly use to search for literature? And what kind of research would you want to include and exclude in answering your question? Now, as an example, here's a kind of mind map I created that kind of puts the question at the center. It gives the context. So obviously I'm looking at research in the UK, but if I'm searching for these terms, I need to search for a lot of different things. So the UK, the United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, but also even specific areas like Scottish higher education, English higher education, so on and so forth. As far as keywords, for the databases, which I'll touch upon after this, we need to think about variations of different words. So variations for higher education, variations of the UK, like I put for location, and other words that maybe mean actions or practices. And of course, also spelling. So decolonizing with an S versus a Z. So databases are usually smart enough to show you both examples because they see the word as the same. They are the same word, they just have different spelling. And then, of course, evidence. This is very important because you need to consider what kind of evidence do you want or need to answer your research question. So, for example, do you want conceptual papers? And by what I mean by that is papers that theorize rather than do, say, interviews or, for example, interventions and then reflections on practice, right? So conceptual papers are more, they're talking about the theory, they're maybe introducing new theory, they're discussing theory, but they're not going away and researching on people or on things, so to speak. And of course, other things. Do you want gray literature? So policy papers are gray literature. So are blogs, although some blogs are actually peer-reviewed. So you might want to consider that as well. And of course, things like media, podcast, video, so on and so forth. So from your research question, a simple formula to follow is this. Your research question allows you to create keywords, which then allows you to create and formulate search strings, right? So again, my keywords here are decolonizing, higher education, the UK, actions and practices. So what you should consider is what other keywords or synonyms might be needed. This can take some time depending on your topic, because if you're so involved in your topic, you may not consider certain words or terms and you may overlook them. But again, this is where your subject librarian can help you to understand this, and of course your supervisor and colleagues. So it's a very good idea to chat with your colleagues about your research question and how it can be broken down. Now, searching for the literature. A good place to start, I think, and some people might disagree, is Google Scholar if you have access to it. It's a good idea just to test the waters, to get an idea of what is out there. However, if you're going to do a systematic narrative review or a systematic review, don't rely on Google Scholar. In this case, you'll need to go through your university library search through the online portal, as this will allow you to search specific databases, specific platforms, and of course, specific literature. And we're going to talk about specific databases and platforms because it's very important to understand the differences between these two, especially if you want to make your search reproducible. Now, who can help? If you're a student, PhD student, your supervisors can help. They're a good place to start, depending on the type of research that you're doing. Of course, again, as I mentioned earlier, subject librarians are a very good, excellent source of information and where you probably should go to if you have access to them. Mainly because they know the databases that your library has access to. And again, each library will have access to different databases. So I may work at Glasgow University, for example, but I study at Strathclyde, and the databases between the two are slightly different. It'll be the same with all universities, I suspect. Also, if you know the topic that you're interested in, you might do an initial search first within that journal. So for example, say that you're interested in teaching English to speakers of other languages, or native speakerism, right? Which I kind of did some research on years ago for my master's. I would recommend looking at, for example, TESOL Quarterly, right? But there are many other journals you can look at too. These are just some example journals depending on your kind of interests. Another way to do this is to take an article that you know well and that you perhaps have read and like, and then put it into a journal, sorry, a database and search for it to see where it comes up, right? I'll get a little bit, I'll kind of clear that up in a bit. I know that it's not very clear from here. Another way, of course, is to kind of reach out to your library to get the full text, especially if you can't find the text. So now this is kind of important. So databases versus platforms. Platforms are probably the ones that you see the most. They're probably the most visible. So for example, we probably know EBSCOhost. You've probably heard of ProQuest, but also Web of Science Core Collection, Scopus, the Directory of Open Access Journals, and Sage Journals. Now, all of these are platforms in that they're kind of super databases. They link out to specific databases, such as ERIC or Education Abstracts or Medline. Those items in yellow that are highlighted in yellow, these are actually multidisciplinary platforms. So you may search for an article on, say, mental health and education, but then it will give you, it will link out to different journals that might relate to education or, mental health specifically, or medicine or psychology as well. So the idea here, the key takeaway is search on several platforms, such as EBSCOhost and Web of Science, for the research, for the literature you're interested in finding, but don't rely on one. Search across a few of them. That way, you will get as many articles as you can in order for your systematic narrative review to be exhaustive. Okay? And again, this helps to ensure kind of a reproducible search. So choose the databases relevant to your area of study. Again, mental health and education, it's going to be a broad range of journals that you'll find that topic in. Okay. So again, for your systematic narrative review or review to be reproducible, you must state which databases or platforms you have used. So record this, take careful details and meticulous records of this. It can be challenging at first. For me, it was very challenging at first. And for the colleagues, students I was kind of studying with, we did find this a challenge. It wasn't easy, right? But when we got into the kind of habit of it, it became easier and easier. Now, creating search strings. I was chatting with a friend yesterday and she's like, oh, this is easy. But actually, I think it's easy if you're very logically minded and if you're good at mathematics. However, if you're not good at building, logical models, you might struggle with this a little bit. And I did. So again, here's my question. Here's my mind map. I used this to kind of create search strings. And what I did was, as you can see here, I took the keywords and I used wildcards. Now, wildcards are marked by the kind of star or asterisk. These help you to find variations of a word, such as decolonizing, decolonize, decolonial, decoloniality, or curricula or curriculum, right? That way you don't have to search the individual words, explicitly. Now, quotation marks allows you to search specific phrases such as United Kingdom or Northern Ireland or higher education. Okay. Now, depending upon the platform you're using, they may use different search operators. So they may need single quotation marks instead of double quotation marks. What you need to do is look on the particular platform to see what does it need. Okay, and I'm going to show you an example using EBSCOhost. Now, this is one of many platforms you can use. EBSCOhost lets you choose specific databases to search, and as a good subject librarian will probably tell you, you probably should choose specific databases relevant to your topic. And again, it totally depends on your topic. As you do this, perform the same search across different platforms to ensure exhaustion of searches. Record the dates, locations of where you searched. And of course, what you should do, I highly recommend, save each respective search within that platform. What I mean is, with EBSCOhost, as one example, you can create a personal account within EBSCOhost to save your searches. This is great for returning to your searches to see, okay, what have I done? Can I update it? Whereas if you do not save your searches, you will have to start from scratch, start from the beginning. And again, speak with your subject librarian, your wonderful subject librarian for top tips, because they know best. Okay, an example of databases. So if we think about the research question that I had said earlier, um, in my case, I was not looking for kind of, oops, let me just see. I was not looking for books, okay? I was looking for journal articles. So in that case, all of these, as an example, were some of the kind of databases that I was going to look at. Maybe even this one as well. But things like anthropology, actually, perhaps yes. But America, no. Books, no. This particular one, no. Okay, and again, these are all different sources, different databases, but this helps me to kind of narrow down the search rather, and also it helps speed up the search. Now, here I'm getting into actually how to do it, and this is coming straight from subject librarians. When you go into your database, what you want to do is you want to search for your key terms only in what's called the title and the abstract. The reason is, if you were to search for one of your key terms in the full text, what might happen is, that happened to me, you might get a paper that has a reference to, say, decolonization in the references, but then in the entire paper, they don't discuss it at all. So this can help you to kind of find the most relevant, most useful articles to your kind of research question. And what you're going to do is slowly create your kind of research, your search strings. So your first search string will be called S1. The next one will be called S2. Now, as you can see here, I was looking for higher education, college, university as a wildcard, post-secondary or post-secondary and tertiary education. And then this means title or abstract, title, abstract. Okay. As you can see here, the first one, the first search string, I had about 33,000 hits. And the next one, I had nearly 5 million papers. Okay. At first, this can be very daunting. It can be very kind of, whoa, that's too much. However, as you will see, as I slowly built up my search strings and combined them, they became fewer and fewer. So in this case, I combined both of these to understand, okay, what is there? Let's see, is it going to show me? Yeah. So S3 is S1 and S2. So as you can see, there's not many. There's around 4,000 articles. Then I was looking at the context, the geographic context. Now this threw up almost 3 million articles. But once I combine these two together, okay, maybe not. I'm mixing those up a little bit. Yeah, once I combine these two together, again, not that many. Now, to be safe, I wanted to look at practices, actions, and variations of that. So I looked for another search. And as you can see, there was nearly 10 million, kind of articles or items that it found. So ultimately, I ended up here, which is about 182 papers in total. Okay. So not many, if you think about it. Now, this is because my particular question, my particular topic was quite unique and is perhaps more of an emerging area of research than an established area of research. Now, one thing to know is duplicates will happen. They will exist across your platforms. One way to get around this within EBSCOhost, for example, is you can look at your results and you can go right to the last result. And what happens in this case is that, well, EBSCOhost is one example, it will remove the results for you. So rather than 180 articles, I actually had 90. So I actually didn't have that many at all. Also, you have to consider, what type of sources are you looking for? Are you looking for journal articles, for example? Are you looking for dissertations, books? Okay. There's also other settings such as language. And also it depends on the country and the context, which we'll come to in a moment. Now, after you have found your literature in a particular database, what you want to do is export it as a what's called an RIS file. So this may be different at your library. It may work slightly differently. I don't know. I'm speaking from the point of view of, working at Glasgow University and studying at Strathclyde, but it should be similar. So when you come to the export manager, you're going to export it as an RIS file. Now, this RIS file will have all of the references that you saw and will allow you to kind of import those and distill them ultimately, which is what we're going to talk about now. So far we have analyzed a research question, created a mind map, or rather looked at a mind map for possible keywords, concepts, and context. And now what we need to do, which actually takes quite a lot of time as well, is the sifting, sorting, filtering, and distilling of the literature. And that's why there's a picture of a distillery here in Glasgow. So one way you can do it is you can use spreadsheets. I tried this myself, but I found it very cumbersome. It took a long time, mainly because the different platforms such as EBSCOhost, Web of Science, the others, when they exported the references, they were formatted slightly differently. And what I mean by that is sometimes journal names were slightly different. Sometimes first and last names of people were either the full name or they were slightly different. There were maybe initials. So it made searching for things very difficult. But this is when I came across something called EPPI Reviewer. Now, EPPI Reviewer is free for up to 1 month or so. So what I would recommend is first you search for your articles and then you use EPPI Reviewer over a period of a month, right? When you actually need to use it. Now, some of the benefits, it can integrate with Zotero, which is open source and more or less free for your reference management. And something I didn't know about and I haven't used, it can integrate with OpenAI's ChatGPT 4.0. Basically, EPI Reviewer allows you to sort, filter your references in a way that makes it much faster and easier for you to work with. So again, it helps you to find duplicates. It helps you to screen the articles very efficiently. So if you're working with other people, this is a perfect way, well, one of the good ways of doing it. Also, it saves you time. You can use a spreadsheet, but I think you will spend more time on the spreadsheet setting it up than you would if you were to use this. So what it allows you to do is you can combine all of the RIS files together. So this is combining all of the references you found, as you can see there. What this then allows you to do is to identify duplicates. And again, this is one of the first steps you have to do before you conduct a systematic review, or rather, it's one of the first steps you need to do in that kind of process before you start reading and analyzing. So EPI Reviewer helps you to identify duplicate results in kind of an automated way. And here's one example, right? As you can see, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes the names of the authors will be slightly different. If you're looking in an Excel spreadsheet, these may be in 2 separate columns, or they may be in one, but ultimately you might spend more time looking for that. Also, journal names, not particularly curriculum journal, but some journal names have short names. And as a result, searching for that journal in a spreadsheet might be more difficult. But as you can see here, we see there are 4 different duplicates, and you can combine those and then exclude them. And as you can see from the searches I did, I had quite a lot of duplicates that I had. Now, again, this is very important because you need to document this process, because at the end of the process, you should have something like this. So you had so many duplicates, so many that you excluded, and the final number of papers that you ultimately used for your systematic narrative review or systematic literature review. Here's an example of what it looks like. Now, what I liked about EPI Reviewer is that I could identify all of these criteria myself. So I could actually modify these. So if you're working alone, that's perfect. If you're working with a team, that's even better because you're working towards the same criteria when you're either including or excluding your content. The other benefits, I could see the title and the abstract right here in a very easy way. Whereas in the spreadsheet, again, it was quite difficult to understand and navigate. So again, you should define your selection criteria. You can even give it a description so that it's very specific, because you might need specific descriptions for, say, intervention or method, and so on and so forth, especially if you're working with teams. So again, as part of your documentation process, you should set the parameters for inclusion and exclusion. And then, of course, sorting the texts. So this is again where EPPI Reviewer helped me in the first part of doing my systematic review, my systematic narrative review. I was able to easily go through, read the titles, read the abstracts first to either include them or exclude them. And then after that, I was able to read based upon full text. So first, you might read on title and abstract, and then second, you would read on full text, especially if you thought, okay, this article is important, it looks interesting, I'll read it. But then when you come here, you might realize, oh, actually, the topic is not relevant, or it is relevant. You can also add comments and keywords in this kind of space, which can help you or your collaborators in kind of going through the literature. Now, at the end of the day, as I mentioned earlier, what you'll need to do is for a systematic review or a systematic narrative review is you need to demonstrate, what you have identified, where you have found it, how many duplicates were removed, what you selected, and, with reasons. So as you can see here, I had almost 300 papers in the beginning, really, as kind of everything combined together. Of these, that many were duplicates. Oops, sorry. I then screened them and I further removed, a bit more. And ultimately, I looked for about 50 papers, of which 30 of those were excluded because either the topic was not the right focus, the study method was not what I was looking for, or the country was not the right one. And in the end, I had about 18 papers in total. This is something that you will put into your paper for your systematic narrative review if you're doing one. So good practices summary. Search your platforms and databases, keep a note of where you searched and when, export the results from each of these as an RIS file, and then import these into EPPI Reviewer. This will allow you to remove the duplicates because that can actually take quite some time. Then the next big chunk of your work is screening the articles first by title and abstract. And then if you want to include some, read those by full text, which will then allow you to search, which will then allow you to kind of filter further, whether including them or not. Record these steps as a diagram, start reading, analyzing, coding, and synthesizing. As far as the next steps, as I just mentioned, actually, again, it's a cyclical process. Now we would probably be around here. Read your papers, take careful notes, start to consider possible themes. Just imagine what they could be. If you're doing a thematic analysis, which I highly recommend because it's quite an interesting and not easy, but it's certainly an understandable way of conducting analysis, is consider reading first and then code during a second reading. The reason is if you read and code at the same time, you will take in less information than if you read it a first time and then read and code a second time, because you will need to remember where things are coming from. And again, Brown and Clark offer some good guidance on, how to do this. And of course, document your entire process because you may need to go back and find out and look up notes rather and see where did you find, a particular article or a set of articles. And there's Brown and Clark. They give a good understanding of an overview of thematic analysis, how to code the literature, and understanding the next stage of conducting a kind of systematic narrative review, which would be qualitative analysis. So doing a systematic narrative review, like a systematic narrative review, or rather systematic review, it's a few stages. The first part is you identify your research question. The second part is you search for the literature, which will take longer than you think. And then the next part is analyzing that literature and also documenting how you have done that. And those are my references. And now we have time for questions.